Hi guys, let's talk about Susan Glaspell and Trifles. So this drama is a really interesting intersection with some of the other themes that we've talked about in nonfiction and suffrage, in the yellow wallpaper in our fiction unit. And this drama is related to a short story that some of you are doing for your analysis, which is A Jury of Her Peers. So Susan Glaspell was born in 1876, and this play was published in 1916. It is loosely based on a real true crime case, which was the murder of John Hossack, and this happened in 1900. So essentially, John Hossack lived on a farm with his wife, and one night his wife called the police sought the police and told them that an intruder had come in and murdered her husband. And she was later arrested at his funeral for his murder. And this was a trial that interested a lot of people. First of all, because it was a woman that was accused of overpowering and murdering her husband in his sleep, which was, considering what we know about the gender roles at the time, was notable. But also, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of traditional emotion coming from Mrs. Hossack. The evidence was pretty circumstantial as to whether or not she actually did it. But Susan Glaspell was a reporter during this trial. She worked for the Des Moines News, and she wrote 25 different articles about this case as it unfolded. And in those articles, you see very early on that Mrs. Hossack is portrayed as sort of a cold, uncaring axe murderer woman. And the more Glaspell got into understanding the situation, she visited the farmhouse, the softer Glaspell became in her treatment of Mrs. Hossack. And there were suggestions that Mrs. Hossack had been abused, and that sort of colored Glaspell's representation of her as sort of more of a desperate victim than a crazy murderer. If you're interested in the trial, Mrs. Hossack went on to be found guilty. Her case was later thrown out on a technicality, and she was retried. Verdict couldn't be reached the second time, and they didn't retry it a third time. So she ended up getting convicted, but essentially getting to live a free life regardless. This play is loosely based on that, and you'll see that in the details of the story. But it essentially deals with this sort of question of guilt and responsibility. And you'll see that the two female characters in the story sort of uncover things about the murder of Mr. Wright that lead them to believe a certain set of circumstances led to those events, and they conceal it. And that sort of speaks to the experience that Glaspell had in understanding how, if Mrs. Hossack had murdered her husband, how that could have happened. I think it's also important to mention that at the time Trifles was published, that women could not serve on juries. And so Mrs. Hossack faced an all-male jury in a situation which Glaspell would have described as that Glaspell was compassionate to as a woman who had, uncovered these sort of signs of abuse. You could imagine, given the gender roles of the period, how an all-male jury would find that less convincing. And that's one of the things that Glaspell is speaking to, both in this story and the short story based on it, A Jury of Her Peers. So there are a number of themes to explore here. Crime and guilt and justice is a big part of it. There are themes of gender and those sorts of things going on in this story. But another thing to pay attention to is the fact that the accused, Mrs. Wright, is not on stage. So our perception of her comes entirely from other characters. So, of course, that's going to be imbued with bias because of the first-person perspective, but it's also going to tell us about the characters who are describing her. The way in which they describe Mrs. Wright is going to inform us or make suggestions to us about those characters themselves. So that's something to pay attention to. This idea of identity as something that is invented by others is something that, of course, connects to the Hossack case. People were making all sorts of assumptions about the accused woman And largely it was just assumption, and that's something that Glaspell sort of interrogating in this play as well. In addition, there's some symbols to watch out for. The canary is definitely one to pay attention to. What birds in flight are conventionally symbolic of, what cages might be, and how that might reflect on the content of the drama and the theme of the drama is something to consider in your read. I look forward to talking about this one with you.